There are certain objects in a house that become almost invisible with time. You stop noticing the bowl on the shelf. The old vase in the corner becomes part of the furniture. A heavy paperweight sits on a desk for decades, doing nothing more exciting than keeping papers from moving. And yet, some of these ordinary pieces of glass can carry stories that reach back generations, and, in a few cases, values that are surprisingly high. The difficulty is that glass is one of the easiest collectibles to misjudge. It often has no obvious maker's mark. There may be no label, no serial number, and nothing that immediately tells you whether you are holding an inexpensive reproduction or something collectors have spent years searching for. That is why appearance alone can be misleading. A piece that sparkles brilliantly may be common, while an older, slightly grey, imperfect-looking glass may be considerably more interesting. A strange colour can matter more than decoration. A tiny mark underneath can completely change the identity of an object. And sometimes, the most important clue is hidden somewhere you would never think to look. So today, we are going through 14 types of old glassware that deserve a second look. Most examples will not make you rich. That is important to understand from the beginning. Much of the old glass people inherit is ordinary, mass-produced, or too common to command serious money. But within those ordinary collections are exceptions. We will begin with the more accessible examples and gradually move toward pieces where rarity, craftsmanship, history, and provenance can push values into the thousands or considerably beyond. And near the end, we will reach an object so ordinary that many families would never think to put it on an inventory of valuables. That is precisely why it is worth paying attention to. Number 14. Depression glass. For many American families, depression glass is less an exotic antique than a memory. Pink, green, amber, and other colored pressed glass pieces were produced in large quantities during difficult economic years and were sometimes distributed through promotions, shops, or everyday household purchases. That history explains why so much of it survives. And because so much survives, most examples are inexpensive. But there is a fascinating imbalance within the category. The ordinary plates and cups may be easy to find, while certain colors, patterns, and serving pieces can be far less common. This is why identifying the pattern matters. A collector does not simply ask, "Is this old depression glass?" They ask, "Which pattern is it? Which color is it? And what exact piece am I holding?" That final question can make a surprising difference. In inherited sets, pay particular attention to unusual serving pieces, lids, pitchers, shakers, and covered dishes. These objects were often produced in smaller quantities than basic plates, and surviving examples can therefore be much harder to find. Condition matters as well. Pressed glass may look sturdy, but chips around rims and edges can have a serious effect on desirability. The larger lesson is simple. A common category can still contain uncommon pieces, and that principle takes us to number 13. Number 13, rare depression glass pieces. Once you understand the basic depression glass market, the rarities become easier to appreciate. Imagine a pattern that survives in hundreds of plates, but only a handful of particular serving pieces. The plates may be everywhere. The unusual butter dish may not be. That difference is exactly what collectors pay attention to. Certain scarce colors, uncommon serving forms, covered dishes, pitchers, and other less frequently preserved pieces can move well beyond the prices associated with ordinary examples. This is one of the great traps of inherited glassware. Families often keep an entire matching set and assume that every piece has approximately the same importance. Collectors do not necessarily see it that way. A lid can matter more than the container beneath it. A rare pitcher can matter more than an entire stack of common plates. Why? Because the market is responding to scarcity. So, when examining an old pressed glass collection, do not simply count how many pieces there are. Look for the pieces that seem strangely absent from other collections. That missing or unusual serving piece may be telling you more than the 10 ordinary plates sitting beside it. And once we leave pressed glass behind, we enter a category where weight, sound, cutting, and makers' names become increasingly important. Number 12. Cut crystal. Few forms of glass are more closely associated with old-fashioned ideas of luxury than cut crystal. Heavy bowls, decanters, drinking glasses, and fruit dishes can look impressive enough to make people assume they must be valuable. But the modern market has been less forgiving than family stories sometimes suggest. A large piece of 20th century cut crystal may have considerable visual appeal while still being relatively inexpensive. What matters is quality, maker, age, design, and condition. Recognized names can change the equation, and certain earlier English, Irish, and Georgian examples can be particularly desirable. There are also simple physical clues worth examining. A genuine crystal object may produce a clear ringing sound when its rim is lightly touched, although sound alone is never an authentication method. Run your eyes over the base. Look for etched names, engraved marks, and other identifying details. Then examine the cutting itself. High-quality cutting tends to have crisp, precise edges. The workmanship should feel deliberate rather than mechanically soft. And remember that weight is only one clue. A heavy glass object is not automatically an important one. That distinction saves collectors from one of the oldest mistakes in this field, confusing expensive-looking with genuinely collectible. The next objects often make exactly the opposite impression. They can look strangely imperfect, and that is part of their appeal. Number 11. Georgian drinking glasses. Some of the most interesting old drinking glasses do not look luxurious at all. They can appear slightly grey, uneven, crooked, or strangely proportioned compared with modern crystal. That is exactly why they are easy to overlook. 18th century English drinking glasses are a fascinating collecting field, particularly examples with unusual twisted stems. Some contain air twists or opaque white twists running through the stem, creating a spiral effect reminiscent of twisted sugar. These details were not merely decorative. They are evidence of the techniques and tastes of an earlier period. Collectors also pay attention to pontil marks, tiny bubbles, tool marks, and the softer appearance of old lead glass. The imperfections can become part of the story. A modern buyer may see a flaw. A collector may see evidence of hand production. That does not mean every old crooked glass is valuable. Age, form, condition, and rarity still matter enormously. But if you find a single strange wine glass at the back of a cupboard, do not immediately dismiss it because it does not match the rest. The odd one out may be the piece worth studying. And that brings us to a category that was once associated with inexpensive entertainment, but eventually developed one of the strongest collector markets in vintage glass. Number 10. Carnival Glass. Carnival glass is immediately recognizable once you know what to look for. Its surface can display a shimmering, rainbow-like iridescence, often in shades associated with gold, amber, blue, green, or purple. It was produced as affordable decorative glass, and some pieces were given away as promotional prizes. That humble beginning is part of what makes the later collecting history so interesting. The common examples can be quite inexpensive, but Carnival glass is not valued simply by its shimmering surface. The color of the underlying glass matters. The pattern matters. The maker matters. And scarcity can make an enormous difference. One of the easiest mistakes is to focus entirely on the iridescent coating. Instead, study the color beneath it. A common marigold piece belongs to a very different part of the market from a scarce example in an unusual color. And be careful with cleaning. The iridescent surface is part of the character collectors are looking for. Aggressive polishing or scrubbing can permanently damage the very feature that makes the piece desirable. It is an interesting example of how preservation can be more important than appearance. The temptation is to make an old object look newer. With collectibles, that can be precisely the wrong thing to do. And some Carnival glass takes this principle much further. Number 9. Rare Carnival glass. Within Carnival glass, the difference between ordinary and exceptional can be enormous. Scarce colours, unusual patterns, and important makers such as Northwood, Fenton, and Millersburg have attracted serious collector attention. Certain rare examples have reached prices far beyond what anyone would expect from an object that originally belonged to a world of inexpensive fairground glass. The remarkable part is the history. These objects were not necessarily treated as luxury possessions when they were new. They could be prizes, inexpensive decorations, or everyday household pieces. Decades later, collectors began looking at the variations that previous generations had ignored. That is often how collecting markets develop. People begin noticing differences that everyone else considered insignificant. A particular color, a particular pattern, a particular mark. And suddenly, the ordinary becomes specific. A maker's mark can therefore be extremely useful. Northwood, for example, used recognizable markings that can help identify its production. But identification should come before valuation. Do not see an unusual color and immediately assume you have found a rarity. Document the shape, pattern, color, and markings first. Then compare it with reliable references or consult a specialist. Because at this point in the list, small differences are beginning to carry very large consequences. Number 8. Scandinavian mid-century glass. Not everything worth collecting is Victorian or Georgian. Some of the most desirable glass in an inherited cabinet may come from the middle of the 20th century. Scandinavian designers produced glass with clean shapes, substantial forms, restrained decoration, and an almost sculptural quality. Swedish names such as Orrefors and Costa, Finnish maker Itala, and Danish producer Holmegard are important names within this broader field. To someone unfamiliar with collecting, these pieces may simply look modern. That is precisely the problem. A family clearing a house may see a vase from the 1950s or 1960s and decide it is too recent to matter. Collectors may see something very different. Certain designs and signed examples can be strongly sought after, particularly pieces associated with important designers. One useful place to begin is the base. Engraved signatures, initials, factory names, and model numbers can be remarkably small. After 50 years, dust and ordinary household use can make them almost invisible. So, if a sculptural glass vase looks unusually well made, turn it over. The information that identifies it may be hiding underneath. And from here, the list begins moving into names that are much more widely recognized. Number 7. Whitefriars glass. Whitefriars is an excellent example of how 20th century design can quietly become collectible. The textured glass associated with Geoffrey Baxter in the 1960s is particularly distinctive. Some pieces have surfaces that resemble bark, bricks, nails, or other rough, natural and architectural textures. The colors can be equally memorable. Oranges, greens, blues, and other strong tones give these objects a presence that was perfectly suited to the sideboards and interiors of their period. But decades later, some examples have become desirable collector pieces. Smaller examples can be relatively accessible, while recognizable forms and unusual colors can command considerably more. The important thing is that Whitefriars often does not rely on a large, obvious signature. Identification can depend heavily on shape, texture, color, and comparison with known designs. That makes photography useful. If you discover a textured vase in an old cupboard, photograph the entire object, including its base, and compare its form with documented examples before deciding that it is simply an old decorative vase. This is also where the idea of the forgotten object becomes particularly powerful. Something can sit quietly in a house for decades, carrying almost no attention from its owners, while becoming increasingly interesting to collectors. And the next category contains even more opportunities for that kind of hidden identity. Number 6. Murano glass. Murano is one of those names that can make people excited too quickly. The Italian island has a famous glass-making tradition, and Murano objects can range from inexpensive tourist pieces to important works associated with major designers and glass-making houses. That distinction is essential. A colorful Murano clown purchased as a souvenir belongs to a very different market from a signed work associated with a major design house. Collectors pay attention to names such as Vanini, Barovier and Toso and Seguso, along with documented designer associations. The best pieces can show remarkable control of color, balance, form, and technique. One of the most useful places to investigate is the base. Look for engraved signatures, original labels, and other identifying marks. And be cautious about cleaning. Old labels can be valuable evidence. Removing one can erase information that helps establish exactly what the piece is. There is also something fascinating about the visual language of Murano. The bright colors and playful shapes can sometimes hide the sophistication of the manufacturing. Two pieces may sit side by side, looking equally colorful, while one is a modest tourist object and the other belongs to a serious design tradition. That is why the name alone is never enough. You need the specific piece, and the next name makes that distinction even more important. Number 5. Lalique. Lalique glass has a distinctive presence. Frosted surfaces, molded figures, birds, fish, flowers, and flowing natural forms can make these pieces immediately recognizable. But recognition is not the same as identification. The detail that collectors pay close attention to is the signature. Early pieces associated with René Lalique can carry a markedly different level of interest from later examples marked simply with the post-war designation. That means a single letter or small difference in the mark can change the category in which the piece belongs. It is a perfect illustration of why you should never value a collectible simply by recognizing its brand name. Old Lalique is not a complete description. You need to know which Lalique, when it was made, how it is marked, what form it takes, and what condition it is in. A magnifying glass can be useful here because marks can be surprisingly subtle. And this is one of those situations where a family member may honestly believe they own a nice Lalique bowl without realizing that the exact signature is the most important clue. The name opens the door. The details tell you what is actually inside the room. And next, we move into one of the most demanding forms of decorative glass to identify. Number 4. Cameo glass. Cameo glass looks almost as though a picture has been carved into the object itself. The technique involves layers of differently colored glass, with portions of the upper layer carefully removed to reveal a design beneath. Flowers, landscapes, foliage, and other decorative scenes can appear in raised layers across the surface. The effect is unmistakable when you know what you are looking at. Run your fingertip gently across the design. On genuine cameo glass, the decoration is physically built into the layered structure rather than simply painted onto the surface. Important English makers include Thomas Webb and Stevens and Williams, while French names such as Gallet and Daume occupy an especially important place in the field. Certain pieces can command substantial sums, but this is also a category where caution becomes increasingly important. Valuable objects attract reproductions. A convincing-looking decorative vase is not necessarily an important antique. The signature, construction, quality of carving, glass layers, condition, and documented comparison all matter. Some signatures are integrated into the decoration itself, making them easy to miss if you only inspect the base. That is why collectors learn to examine the entire object. The most valuable clue may not be sitting conveniently underneath it. And now we arrive at a glass tradition where iridescence becomes almost magical. Number 3, Tiffany Favrile and related iridescent glass. Some glass seems to contain color rather than merely reflect it. Tiffany Favrile glass is famous for this effect. The surface can shift between gold, blue, green, and other tones, producing the impression of oil moving across water. The pieces were made in New York around the beginning of the 20th century, and examples can range from small objects to highly desirable vases. One useful mark to look for is LCT, associated with Louis Comfort Tiffany. But again, the presence of a famous name does not automatically establish a high value. The exact object, condition, design, and authenticity all matter. Related iridescent glass from makers such as Lalique can also be highly collectible, including examples that are not obviously signed. This is where visual judgment becomes important. On good iridescent glass, the color appears deeply integrated into the surface, rather than looking like a simple coating applied afterward. And there is an unfortunate history of these objects being cleaned because someone believed the strange rainbow effect was dirt or residue. In reality, that unusual surface could be one of the most important characteristics of the object. It is a reminder that restoration and preservation are not the same thing. Sometimes the feature that looks least familiar to us is precisely the feature collectors want to protect. And the final two categories take us from decorative art into objects carrying historical messages. Number 2, engraved Georgian and Jacobite glasses. Imagine holding a drinking glass made more than 2 centuries ago. At first, it might seem small and rather plain. Then you notice an engraving. Perhaps there is a rose, a pair of buds, a thistle, a ship, a coat of arms, or a few carefully arranged words. Suddenly, the object is no longer simply a drinking vessel. It may be evidence of political allegiance, social identity, celebration, or historical events from the 18th century. Jacobite glasses are particularly fascinating because some were associated with supporters of the Stuart cause. Certain engraved examples can command thousands of pounds, while especially rare forms, including some glasses with inscriptions ending in Amen, have achieved considerably higher prices. The important lesson is not to memorize one symbol and assume you have found a treasure. Engraving needs to be studied as a whole. Look at the design, look at the lettering, look at the quality of the glass, look at the age indicators, and, most importantly, do not polish or alter an old engraved glass before it has been properly examined. The scratches and markings that seem insignificant may be the very evidence that identifies the object. There is something extraordinary about this category. A glass that once sat on a table during an era of political uncertainty can survive for generations without anyone remembering what its symbols meant. The family sees decoration. History sees a message. And that brings us to number 1. Number 1. Antique glass paperweights. The most surprising object on this list may be the one that spends most of its life doing the least impressive job. A paperweight. Something heavy and rounded, sitting on a desk and holding down envelopes or paperwork. To many families, it is simply an old, decorative object. Collectors can see something very different. The finest 19th century French paperweights were made by houses including Baccarat, Saint-Louis, and Clichy. Inside their glass bodies, tiny colored canes can form flowers, patterns, and miniature designs. The term mille fiori, meaning 1,000 flowers, describes some of these intricate internal arrangements. And the craftsmanship can be astonishing. A piece that appears to be a simple glass dome from the outside can contain an entire miniature world inside it. Values vary enormously, but important antique paperweights can reach into the thousands or tens of thousands, with exceptional examples going much higher. The first thing to do with an old paperweight is therefore not to admire the shine. Look inside, examine the tiny canes, look for unusual patterns, inspect the base. Some examples contain extremely small identifying details associated with their makers. A tiny mark can matter. The arrangement of the internal design can matter. The condition can matter, and the history of the piece can matter. This is one of the clearest examples of the central lesson of old glassware. The most important information may be hidden inside the object. But there is an even bigger story beyond paperweights. Among the most extraordinary glass objects ever sold are not necessarily brightly colored, heavily decorated, or obviously luxurious. One remarkable example is an ancient Roman cage cup. The vessel dates back roughly 17 centuries and represents an extraordinary feat of glass carving, with an outer cage separated from the inner drinking vessel. To modern eyes, an object like this can look strangely modest. It may simply appear old, greenish, and unfamiliar. Yet its historical and artistic significance places it in an entirely different world from ordinary household glass. One example sold for more than £2.5 million. And that is the point at which the entire subject begins to make sense. The value of glass is rarely written across its surface. It lives in the details. It can be in the color. It can be in the maker. It can be in the signature. It can be in the technique. It can be in the rarity of a particular form. Or it can be in the story that connects the object to another time. So, if you have a cabinet full of old glass, the sensible approach is not to assume that everything is valuable. It is to stop assuming that everything is worthless. Take each unusual piece to a good light, turn it over, examine the base, look for marks, signatures, labels, twists, bubbles, unusual colors, engraved designs, and construction details. If you have a UV light, examine suspicious colored glass under it. If a piece appears to be made from layered glass, feel the design carefully. If an old drinking glass has an unusual stem, study it rather than dismissing it. And if you find something genuinely unusual, do not rush to clean it, repair it, throw it away, or accept the first price someone gives you. Preservation comes before valuation, because that is the deeper lesson hidden inside this entire subject. Old glass is not valuable simply because it is old. It becomes interesting when rarity, craftsmanship, condition, identity, and history come together. The ordinary-looking object may have survived because nobody recognized what made it special, and sometimes that is exactly what makes collecting so rewarding. A cabinet is not just a collection of things, it is a record of what previous generations bought, used, admired, ignored, and eventually forgot. The piece you have never thought about may be common, it may be worth very little, but until you know what it is, you do not really know which of those two possibilities you are looking at. So before the next clear-out, before the charity box is filled, and before an old cabinet disappears into someone else's hands, take another look, not at the sparkle, at the details. Because in old glass, the difference between ordinary and extraordinary can be surprisingly small, and sometimes it is hiding where nobody